One cannot deny that no other murder mystery in the history of the movies has inspired so many people than Hitchcock's Psycho. Hitchcock is considered one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. So what was Gus Van Sant's intention to do a remake? In a film comment with the actors, he tells.
So I was under the impression that there was a distance between like a silent movie from 1960 to an audience of 1998. Our knowledge of silence is that they're moving fast, they're funny, and they move fast, when in fact they weren't designed to do that at all. They were shot at a slower speed, and they were supposed to be projected at a slower speed. So in fact, they didn't move faster at all, but technology was so distant that in the 50s when they're showing them on TV, they just said, it's a funny old movie,
Wow.
So they're just funny anyway, so we don't really care whether they're the right speed or not.
And besides, the 1998 movie is more modern because it's not shot in black and white anymore and the sound is better. There are some other significant differences. Some scenes, like this one in the older version, takes longer than in the newer one. In the interview with the French filmmaker François Truffaut, Hitchcock says, the first part of the story was a red herring. You know that the public always likes to be one jump ahead of the story. They like to feel they know what's coming next. So you deliberately play upon this fact to control their thoughts. The more we go into the details of the girl's journey, the more the audience becomes absorbed in her flight. That's why so much is made of the motorcycle cop.
Hold it right there.
A fact a lot of people do not know is that Hitchcock had a lifelong fear of the police. That's why he let policemen look in his movies almost scary, the opposite of the image of the policeman as a friend and helper. According to Hitchcock, going to the police is a dull.
Can you remember any specific instance when you were frightened as a child?
Well, I have a vague recollection of being scared by a policeman. I think that when I was probably about 4 or 5 years of age, being sent with a note to the local police station and being shut in a cell as a punishment for some mishap or I don't even know what it was for. It doesn't apply to me. I'm still scared of policemen.
What we can see here is that Marion Crane, played by Anne Heche, in the 1998 version looks much more frightened than Janet Leigh. Even if Anne Heche said in an interview it wasn't the actor's intention to play in another or a more modern way. This is the voyeur scene. It's a sophisticated identification between Norman Bates, the voyeur, and the audiences. In fact, we are all voyeurs. Hitchcock says to Truffaut, I'll bet you that 9 out of 10 people, if they see a woman across the courtyard undressing for bed, or even a man puttering around in his room, will stay and look. Because scenes like that were forbidden in the 1960s, Hitchcock just drops a hint what Norman is doing while watching Marion. However, Gus Van Sant shows the whole masturbation scene in full length and with sound we don't want to watch here. The famous shower scene. Gus Van Sant says,
My question was, would it be the same film? Would it actually be Psycho if you took every single piece and connected it together? Would it in fact be the same film? It's something like the same thing. It's like a restaging of.
It took Alfred Hitchcock and his team 7 days to shoot that scene, and there were 70 camera setups for 45 seconds of footage. What was a shocker for the viewers in 1960 was not only the brutality, but that one of the main characters died after not even half of the movie was shown. The majority of the viewers in 1998, of course, knew what would happen. To see the murder in color is not much more shocking than in the older version, anyway. They also used the same famous psycho-violent screech sound, which is now used for many other horror film scenes too. Have you recognized this? This potentially signals the film to be the work of Van Sant, the author. It might acknowledge its failure as an exact recreation of the original, an experiment of Van Sant. Besides, they had a torso specially made up for that scene, with the blood that was supposed to spurt away from the knife, but they didn't use it. They had a naked model who stood in for Janet Leigh. The only thing we can actually see from Janet in that scene is only her hand.
Well, Psycho is my first attempt at a shocker. In other words, it has in its content certain episodes which do shock. In some sense it could be called a horror film, but the horror only comes to you after you've seen it, when you get home in the dark.
In that scene, Hitchcock used a single shot of the detective coming up the stairs, and when he got to the top step, he deliberately placed the camera very high for two reasons. The first was so that he could shoot down on top of the mother, because if he'd shown her back, it might have looked as if he was deliberately concealing her face, and the audience would have been leery. Therefore, Hitchcock used a high angle in order not to give the impression that he was trying to avoid showing her. And again, Gus Van Sant's experimental extra scenes of strange pictures to reinforce the horror effect. When Detective Milton Arbogast falls down the stairs, the viewer has, according to Truffaut, the feeling that he's going down the stairs backward, brushing each step with the tip of his foot, like a dancer. Hitchcock filmed that scene by doing a separate dolly shot down the stairway without the man. Then they set the actor Martin Balsam in a special chair in which he was in a fixed position in front of the transparency screen showing the stairs. He simply just had to throw his arms up, waving them as if he'd lost his balance.
They know I can't even move a finger. And I won't. I'll just sit here and be quiet, just in case they do.
In the end, Norman sits in a room at the police station. In both movies, the imaginary voice of his mother is heard, protesting that the murders were Norman's doing and that she wouldn't even harm a fly. The evil is shown as a skull on his face.
They'll see and they'll know, and they'll say, why, she wouldn't even harm a fly.
there's a whole thing in our culture, which is there's this whole, like, a huge sports mentality, which is if you're doing Psycho, that means you're challenging the original filmmaker.
But it didn't feel like a challenge. It's much more a remembrance of Hitchcock. In Hitchcock's words, I take pride in the fact that Psycho, more than any of my other pictures, is a film that belongs to filmmakers, to you and me.